So normally about now I begin to yawn, but I'm going to try not to today. And that didn't last very long. As soon as I thought about it, I did it. Alright. This week's lecture is on digital image analysis. Now, I'm not going to be talking specifically about what we do in digital image analysis, but what digital images are, the information we collect, how that all works, that sort of stuff. Just the basic background things. When we get into other lectures further down through the semester, we'll take a deeper look at this. So the first thing I want to cover is electronic aerial imaging, and we're going to look at digital photography and videography. So why electronic imaging? Well, in general, that has been the trend, whether we're talking about consumer stuff or we're talking about science and research related stuff. We've moved away from digital, or moved away from film and into the digital territory. USGS, for example, stopped selling hard copy or aerial images in 2004, so it's been 15 years, give or take, since you could literally buy actual print copies from USGS. Now everything is available electronic and free. And the beauty of electronic storage is it's cheaper. Now, the question is it going to be more long-lasting? There have been some studies that looked at a lot of different stuff in terms of the life and how long we can expect some of this newer media to last. And while in terms of wear and tear, something like a CD-ROM or a DVD appears to hold up and compare good to paper, books and things. We know that there is a limited life expectancy on things like thumb drives and external hard drives before the technology wears out and they cease to function. We know that as technology advances, older interfaces are left behind. For example, data that might have been stored on a 5.5-inch floppy disk might still be fine on that disk, but how in the heck are you ever going to get that data off there? You'd have to go to a museum to find a drive for something like that. So these electronic formats may be cheaper in the short term, but in the long term, the best evidence we have is that printed information on paper tends to last longer, thousands of years, and still retain some degree of utility. But the good thing about our digital format, it is computer compatible. It also offers a greater range of sensitivity. In general, these sort of things are easier to calibrate. Electronic sensors have a linear response, where film has a log linear response, and it's only for part of the range. And digital electronic stuff has a rapid turnaround time, and you can literally potentially view and transmit images that you collect in flight. So let's just talk a little bit about the types of sensors that are out there when we talk about this. Scanners, we'll discuss that just a little bit later, but as far as videography goes, shuttered cameras, which are analogous to video recording with digital frame grabbers, digital video recordings. We also have digital cameras, large format and small format, which the small format basically means it's like your standard 35mm camera with film, or the kind of digital camera you might go buy at Walmart or Sam's Club or Target or one of those places. And then we can set these things up where we can have an array of cameras, or we can use something called a push broom. So what are some of the advantages of taking aerial videography? It is one of the cheapest methods, and it can use an audio track, so you can be, as you're recording it, making verbal notes about what you're seeing, so that you'll know what you're thinking when you go back through it. Disadvantages: it's difficult to index because it is continuous. It's also difficult to view, and you have a limited or a lower spatial resolution. Next thing we want to talk about is small format photography. Now remember, this is a camera that is more similar to the kind of digital camera you might buy commercially for the average home owner or customer. It is a relatively cheap method to acquire your own data. I mean, literally, if you have something like this, the only thing you got to do is rent a helicopter or an airplane, or in today's world, buy a drone. Um, and another big benefit is you have complete control over when you get this data, what's the time of acquisition, and spatial resolution. It's not something you always have control over. However, you will need to mount the camera somehow, and there's different types. Some will mount on the window, others mount in the bottom of the aircraft, in which case you have to have aircraft that are modified specifically for this. And this is an example of one of those window mounts for a small plane. And you see this rather large digital camera that is sitting on this mounting setup. You can also then roll this thing and control it. You can see there's various means in the bottom as far as you can use to crank it so that it leans in or out more. And this is the sort of level of quality that you can expect to collect with something like this. Now the problem that you have with small format photography is you don't get to cover very much area with each picture. And so you're forced to do something called creating a mosaic. And a mosaic is just like a mosaic tile, where the tile, mosaic tile bathroom is made up of tiny pieces of tile. That's what you end up with in a scenario like this. The final picture that you want to look at is made up of many pictures. And the key is the ability to line up where features are in the same position from one photo to the next, so that they line up, so that when you look across all of them, it looks seamless. And this is an example of a mosaic from a graduate student's research work at WVU. Now, having discussed a little bit about how we would collect that, let's talk a little bit about how and what actually happens inside of a standard digital camera. Most cameras have a chip inside that collects this data, and it's something called a Bayer array. And the Bayer array basically collects data in 3 different initial bands. It collects more data in the green spectrum than any other. The second most data is collected in the blue, and very little is in the red, because the blues and greens tend to make up more of what we see visually than the reds. It then uses an interpolation technique to fill in all the blank spots, so that we end up with these 3 bands at the end for what the red expected value is, the green expected value, and the blue expected value. So that when we put those together, every cell in the picture has a red, green, and blue value, thus giving us a real color. Here's another system called a Foveon chip, where each pixel has 3 sensors. And each one of the sensors transmits light to the lower sensors. There's no need for any sort of interpolation. So each sensor basically collects all 3 pieces of information. At the time these slides were put together, this was somewhat limited in adoption, but I'm sure it has increased since then. And the idea is that instead of interpolating what these values are, we just go ahead and measure the actual red, green, and blue for everything. And as technology gets better, as storage and memory gets better, as processing speed gets better, this is the direction where we will definitely be. So let's look at some of these setups and how this might work in the more modern setup. Here we have a camera shooting out the bottom of a aircraft, running off of some sort of a power supply with a ruggedized laptop and a video camera that shows sort of what we're looking at below. And this is a Positive System 8R100. This actually uses a 35mm camera, or that can use this Kodak CCD array. where it has the blue, green, red, and near infrared. That's the one on the right here. Both of these systems are going to allow you to collect data from above, if you will. But the digital format is much superior. So this is a picture of a place near Morgantown, West Virginia called Chestnut Ridge, and this is using the ADAR 1000 aerial image. We talk about these arrays of cameras. That is not a single camera, but multiple cameras. And so this is another way of doing this, where you take a camera and have it set up to measure a single band or frequency or range of frequencies. And so you may set up 3 to 8 cameras. For example, one for red, one for green, one for blue, one for near infrared. After you acquire all the images, you have to spatially register them. In other words, you more or less georeference the position so that you can then stack up individual things over top one another and develop this multispectral stack where you now have a red, a green, a blue, and a near infrared for each location. Now this can be difficult sometimes. This is an example of one of those camera arrays. This is a little bit older setup, as you can tell by the black and white photo of these antique cameras. But basically these cameras would be loaded with film. One that was sensitive to near infrared, one to red, one to green, one to blue, etc. And these would all be wired up electronically to operate at the same time, so that when you took a picture with all 4 cameras. Now, I mentioned earlier this idea of a push broom sensor. A push broom sensor is one of the 2 primary types that we deal with today, and this particular one has 4 multispectral bands, and it has 8 of these CCD, these charged, I can't remember what a CCD thing is. Charged coupled device, I think it is. It's a lines, each one has 12,000 pixels, and so there's a lot of information that's being taken up. And you can do panachromatic or photogrammatic. You can measure nadir, and you can look up to as much as 16 degrees backward with these sensors. Now, what can you actually do with this stuff? I'm going to give you an example. This was an example of small format digital photography, where they map these particularly unusual plants called silver swords. And this is in the caldera of a volcano in Hawaii. And the concern was, were they damaging the plants by allowing tourists to come through and look at them? Now, they had a footpath, an area designated where you could go, but you had to stay in it. And what they were wondering is, are the plants okay, or are they dying at a higher than expected rate, or dead at a higher than expected rate along the trail? Now you might say, well, this seems pretty lame. Here's the problem. These silver swords, they are a very arid environment type of fauna, or flora rather. When they're alive and when they're dead, they don't look much different to the naked eye for a very, very long time. They're used to existing in low water environments, and a dead one just doesn't look that different for a very, very long time. But if you get into the near infrared, you can see the difference. And so what they wanted to do was take digital cameras with the right sort of sensing setups, collect these pictures, identify where these things were, look at them in these other spectral ranges, and determine whether they were alive or dead. And then they could determine whether the clusters of the dead plants were spatially autocorrelated to the footpath. So this shows you the sort of the crater wall, and you can kind of see the inside of it, the volcano. This is what it looks like from above. And this is the ground reference data that's co-registered to the imagery. and basically they have these spectral signatures that they're looking for. And when they get into the color infrared image, you can see that some of them are red and some of them are green. Dead ones are much higher in the red than the green ones, which are alive. Next, I want to talk a little bit about orthophotos. Now, we mentioned those the other day, and how orthophotos are ones who have the various sort of distortions, like the radial displacement and elevation displacement removed, so that everything always looks like you're looking straight down every pixel. And that's important to remember. So that's why I brought it up again. So I want to talk a little bit some of these sensors, the electrochemical sensors that electromechanical sensors rather, we're using. We're going to look at the properties, and we're going to compare those properties across the traditional film versus these electromagnetic sensors. In terms of their spectral range, okay, and when we talk about spectral range, we're talking about basically just this part of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can actually collect our data on. And you can see with the film, we're kind of limited between 0.3 and 0.9 micrometers, which is a limited range. But when we go to the electromagnetic sensors, we can go from 0.3 all the way up to 14, which is a much broader range. As far as specific spectral bands, the bands tend to be very broad in film. In other words, they cover a lot of spectral range in an individual band. So you have wider bands. But in the electromagnetic sensors, you can have wide bands or you can have very narrow bands. As far as how many, in film, 1 or 3 is typically where you're looking at. Whereas in the electromagnetic sensors, anywhere from 1 to in excess of 200 bands. And this turns out to be important later on. We'll talk about how we can use that to our advantage. Calibration to radians. The sun shines a little different every day. How do you calibrate your results to how bright the sun is from one day to the next? Turns out with film, it's not easy because the development of your film is a chemical process, and so if you have some means of identifying what the specific radiance on a day was, you would then have to adjust your chemical process to offset that. And like I said, that's difficult. With these electromagnetic sensors, it is very much possible. You can do this. In terms of the radiometric response, it's nonlinear and it has a limited range. So that means that as you go, further away, there's sort of an exponential curve, and it makes your accuracy fail a bit because you get well beyond what you're sort of calibrated to or for. Whereas your electromagnetic sensors are linear in their response, and so that gives you a very wide range where you can collect data, which goes back up to that much larger spectral range that you can examine. As far as supplies, the biggest drawback with film is film. You can only collect pictures while you have film. When the film's gone, the job's done. No, job may not be done, but you're out of film, so you got to go back and get more. Whereas with these electromagnetic sensors, if you have digital storage space and power, electricity, that's all you need to make this process continue. As far as the communication of the data that you're collecting, if you're using film, you have to get the film, send it to a lab, have it developed, and then run that through the process of whatever you're doing remote sensing wise. Whereas with your electromagnetic sensors, it's digital, and so depending on your setup, you might be able to transmit it literally from the plane or the satellite or wherever right to your base of operations. Some of the other things that we need to wrap our mind around is this idea of resolution elements. So when we talk about the resolution, of electronic or digital imagery. We talk about our pixels, and we can talk about pixel size in a couple of different ways, but essentially for every pixel there is a certain size spot on the ground that pixel represents. And we call this an instantaneous field of view, and basically what it amounts to is if you measure that width of the area that you're looking at through the lens and the height of the aircraft, when you reach the ground level there's a certain size space that you're collecting information from, and that's what happens. Now, as the flight height increases, the pixel sizes gets bigger, but the instantaneous field of view, in other words that angle, it stays the same. And so the amount of space that you see on the ground really is dictated by how high you fly. The higher you fly, the more area covered by a pixel. In other words, the less detailed the results. Now, within each pixel, we have a lot of different information. Could just simply be a couple of bands that gives us, whether it's what the value is in blue or green or red. But the basic format of pixel is basic raster design. All we have in each cell is a value, and that value is a color. The color is made up of the multiple bands, and that's pretty much how it works. So pixel size is basically the same thing as resolution. Objects of the same size as a pixel are likely to find themselves within 4 pixels, and this is something called a mixed pixel. I've talked about this, I think, a little bit last week. The idea is that when you look down from a sensor, whether it's on a satellite or an airplane, the likelihood that the individual pixel lines up to the edge of the individual object is pretty daggone slim. And it's more likely that if your pixel resolution is, say, 3 meters by 3 meters, and you're looking at an object that's 3 meters by 3 meters, that it's probably not going to be in a single pixel, but across multiple pixels. In order for an object to be visible, just a general rule of thumb, it needs to be about twice the size of the pixel dimensions. That way, you're likely to get at least one pure pixel out of it. So, if you have an object that, if your resolution is 3 meters, then you're probably looking at, in order to spot an object, it needs to be at least 6 meters across. Again, resolution is also determined by the object and the background contrast ratio. Small, very bright objects with a dark background are easier to pick up. Large objects, similar to background, could also be easy to spot. Next, I want to talk about another kind of scanner. We talked about a push broom ever so little, and then we're going to just slightly talk a little bit about this idea of a cross track or a whisk broom scanner. And so where a push broom is like a big old shop broom that you shove in one direction, a whisk broom is like a whisk broom where you whisk it from side to side. And what happens is, instead of taking all the data at once, a whisk broom scanner harvests information based on an instantaneous field of view to a particular pixel size, and it does it in passes from side to side. It uses a rotating mirror to do this, and basically as it makes these as it collects this data, the image that it's finding is second by second based on this, and it makes it a little more complicated to store the data, but at the end of the day you get all this overlapping information. Now, how does it work? Well, light comes in, hits a rotating mirror, goes through some sort of device, works back through a series of things like this diachronic grating, which separates out certain things. It goes up, and some of the light goes through, some is reflected off. The stuff that's reflected off hits a prism. The prism splits it relative to different frequencies. Each of these things then target specific sensors, and ultimately all this stuff is recorded electronically. And that's how this will work. And so as it's moving across this image, at any given spot, it's pulling in all that information and then dividing it all up between all this different stuff and recording it, and then moving on to the next pixel as it continues its whisk motion from side to side. The long track, or the push broom, is very different. So instead of having a single sensor that's recording everything, you have an array. In this case, it's a linear detector array. So instead of a single camera lens, imagine a row of lenses all together, or a very wide lens that's also very narrow. Focuses through some sort of an optics device and has its own instantaneous field of view, goes down to the ground, and it covers this entire swath. In other words, this distance from side to side. And as the aircraft moves along in one direction, as it moves, it collects data moving forward. So let's compare them a little bit. Whisk broom has a short dwell time to collect photons. In other words, because it's moving side to side and forward at the same time, it doesn't spend a lot of time at any given spot, and so it can't collect really, really long wavelengths because it's not there long enough. It also has a lot of moving parts. Moving parts tend to break, wear out, need calibration. And it doesn't have very many detectors, so there's not as many things that could go wrong, but if one of them goes wrong, it has a significant impact on your overall data. Push brooms have a CCD array. Each band has its own array. It has a longer dwell time and many detectors. That means you get a better signal to noise ratio. In other words, you can pick up so much more. It has an intercalibration between detectors, and so you can see if things that you've scanned from one time to the next are appropriate. It was originally limited to approximately 0.9 micrometers. Now you can go up to as much as 2.4. Fewer moving parts. It also requires a lot less energy to run. How did these sensors evolve? Well, let's take a look. We started off with these electromechanical sensors where we had this individual detector going through a lens, bouncing off of something, hitting a scanning mirror, and acting very much like a push broom. The push broom, a whisk broom. The push broom, simple detector array going through a lens, recording everything across the entire width of that track in intervals as it moves forward. Then we begin to use these electromechanical imaging spectrometers, which were much more sophisticated instruments. And instead of having a single discrete detector, they had an array, and they had a lot more components to making this process work, and that allowed them to collect more information as the whisk broom went along. Similarly, with the advent of our other push broom type sensors, we now have much larger arrays that can collect even more data of different types, and is a significant improvement over what we had earlier. As far as the platforms that we utilize to collect this information, the primary two are aircraft and satellites. Aircraft are cheap, but they're not terribly stable. They work pretty good for film because you can change your navigation as you need to. You can start and stop missions if you want. You get the images collected right now wherever you want. Now recently we've integrated sophisticated GPS and INS, which is an abbreviation for inertial navigation systems, that made it possible to automate this idea of rectification, so that we can now specifically identify where these photos are on the Earth and the angle that they were collected from. Satellites are in a whole different ball of wax. They're originally something that the military rationalized because they were basically secret and people wouldn't know that they were actually being imagery taken. But they're also very expensive. And they're also very stable, and they work really well for a lot of these scanning devices. But they're very, very high. That means you don't have a lot of topographic distortion. but you need alternator viewing if you want to have stereoscopic images. So that concludes what I wanted to talk about for this week, and in the coming weeks we're going to really start to tie some of this stuff together. We've talked about some of these concepts of how we can measure these things in photos, how we can collect them, sort of some of the history of it, some of the science behind the different wavelengths and that sort of stuff. Now we're talking about how the sensors work and what actually goes into these digital images, and then the things that we're going to be talking about next is how we can classify out these images to identify things, the various work that we have to do beforehand, the prep work, if you will. We'll talk about the spatial and the spectral properties and what that means for what we're doing. Hyperspectral analysis, change detection, a lot of really interesting and cool things that you have been doing in the labs, and they will make more and more sense as we move further and further along with what we're doing here, with the ultimate goal being to understand that from any source of electromagnetic energy, some is always absorbed or reflected or passes through, and it differs from thing to thing. And so if we can create an environment where we have a sensor that is capable of monitoring these things and recording this information across a large enough area, and we understand how things that we're looking at respond relative to these frequencies, we can figure out which range of values to look for to tell things apart. And if we can do that, we can then convert this imagery with a relatively high degree of certainty into information, not just color values, but actual information as to what things are. And that's sort of what remote sensing boils down to. It is that science of figuring out what stuff is. Alright, you have a relatively short lab for this week. Take about an hour and a half to do. But you also got a relatively short lecture, so that frees you up a little bit more time. This week, as you recall, is a completely online week in our hybrid format. We don't have a lot of them, but this is one of them. And you also have a take-home exam. The take-home exam will include the lecture materials from tonight. And so when you're studying, if you study before you take an open note exam, you probably don't. But all the lecture slides up to this point are free game as far as finding test questions, and they should be the places that you go to look for information to help you answer appropriately. So, good luck on the homework. I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and I hope you do well in the exam, and I'll see you in class next week.